You're eating something right now. Or you were recently. Or you're about to. And whatever it is, there's an extremely high probability that at some point before it reached your mouth, someone applied heat to it. A flame, a burner, an oven, a microwave humming quietly in a break room while someone stands next to it staring into the middle distance. Heat, fire, cooking. You do this so automatically, so completely without thinking, that it probably has never once occurred to you to ask why. Why do we cook food at all? Every other animal on this planet manages to eat without a stove. Wolves don't roast their deer. Chimpanzees don't saute their fruit. The entire animal kingdom, across millions of species, in every climate and ecosystem on Earth, eats raw food and gets along just fine. And then, there's us, the one species that decided at some point in the deep past to set its food on fire before putting it in its mouth. And not only did we decide to do that, we became so dependent on it that we literally cannot survive properly without it anymore. Our bodies changed. Our brains changed. Our faces changed. The entire trajectory of human evolution pivoted around a campfire and a piece of meat that fell into it at the wrong moment. This is not a cooking video. This is an origin story. And by the end of it, you will never look at a meal the same way again. Let's start with something that sounds obvious, but is actually deeply strange when you sit with it. Humans are the only species on Earth that cooks its food. Not the only species that uses fire. Not the only species that processes food before eating it. The only species that systematically, universally, across every culture that has ever existed anywhere on this planet, applies heat to food before consumption. Think about what that means. We have documented hundreds of human cultures across history and across the globe. Cultures separated by oceans, by mountain ranges, by thousands of years of independent development. Cultures that had no contact with each other for millennia. Cultures whose languages, religions, social structures, and technologies have almost nothing in common. Every single one of them cooked. Not most of them, not the majority, all of them. There is no documented human culture, past or present, that subsists entirely on raw food. The anthropologist Richard Wrangham, who we will spend a lot of time with in a few minutes because his ideas are genuinely world-altering, calls this the cooking paradox. The behavior is so universal, so consistent, so ancient, that it cannot be a coincidence or a cultural invention. It has to be something deeper. It has to be biological. Cooking isn't something humans learned to do. It's something humans became. But before we get to what cooking did to us, we need to talk about how it started. Because nobody sat down one afternoon and decided to invent cuisine. That's not how this works. The actual origin of cooking is almost certainly the least glamorous story in human history, and it involves what is essentially a very long series of accidents, followed by a very slow realization. Fire has been part of the human story for an extraordinarily long time. The oldest confirmed evidence of controlled fire use by human ancestors dates back roughly 1 million years from Wonderwork Cave in South Africa. And if you listened closely, you'll recognize that detail because it came up in the smoking video too, which tells you something important. Fire didn't just change one thing about us. It changed everything. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors sat around fires. They used fire for warmth, for protection from predators, for light in the dark, and at some point, inevitably, food fell into the fire. An animal carcass dragged back to camp, a root vegetable sitting too close to the edge of the flames, a pile of seeds scattered by the wind in the wrong direction. Something burned, and someone, some ancestor of ours who we will never know the name of, tasted it anyway. Because when you're hungry enough, you eat the burnt thing. You eat it because the alternative is not eating. And when they tasted it, something was different. It was softer. It was easier to chew. And here's the part that matters most. It tasted better. Not slightly better, dramatically, compellingly, almost irresistibly better. And that preference, that gut-level pull toward cooked food over raw food, was not random. It was evolution already beginning to notice something. Here's what cooking actually does to food. And this is where the science gets genuinely fascinating. When you apply heat to raw food, you are not just making it warm. You are fundamentally transforming its chemical structure in ways that have enormous consequences for the animal eating it. Take starch, the primary carbohydrate in most plant foods. In its raw form, starch is organized into tight, dense granules that the human digestive system struggles to break down efficiently. When you cook starch, those granules swell, rupture, and reorganize into a form that digestive enzymes can access far more easily. The result is that cooked starchy foods deliver dramatically more usable calories than raw ones. A raw potato contains around 65 calories. A cooked potato, same weight, delivers closer to 95 calories. That gap is not trivial when you are a prehistoric human burning enormous amounts of energy hunting and foraging every single day. Protein behaves similarly. Raw meat contains tightly coiled protein structures that are difficult for digestive enzymes to unwind and break apart. Cooking denatures those proteins, unfolding them, making them dramatically easier to digest. Studies of people who try to subsist on entirely raw diets consistently find that they struggle to maintain body weight, even when eating large quantities of food, because so much of the caloric content of raw food simply passes through the body before it can be absorbed. Cooking is not just making food taste better. Cooking is unlocking calories that would otherwise be inaccessible. It is, in the most literal biological sense, getting more energy out of the same amount of food. And in a world where finding food was the central challenge of every single day, that difference was not a minor convenience. It was potentially the difference between survival and starvation. And now we arrive at Richard Wrangham. Because in 1999, a Harvard primatologist published a hypothesis so radical, so sweeping in its implications, that it genuinely divided the field of anthropology and sparked a debate that continues to this day. Wrangham's argument, laid out in his 2009 book Catching Fire, goes like this. Cooking didn't just help early humans survive. Cooking caused the evolutionary changes that made us human in the first place. The central evidence is a pattern in the fossil record that has always needed explaining. Around 1.8 million years ago, the human lineage underwent a dramatic anatomical transformation. Homo erectus, the ancestor that appeared at that time, looked strikingly different from what came before. Smaller teeth, smaller jaw muscles, smaller digestive tract, and a significantly larger brain. All of these changes happened together in the same geological window, and all of them point in the same direction. An animal that had recently started eating food that was easier to digest. Smaller teeth make sense if your food is softer. Smaller gut makes sense if your digestive system no longer needs to do as much heavy lifting. And the larger brain, the crown jewel of human evolution, the thing that ultimately separates us from every other species on this planet, also makes perfect sense in this context, because brains are extraordinarily expensive to run. The human brain consumes roughly 20% of the body's total energy at rest. That is an enormous metabolic investment. You cannot afford a brain that size if you are spending all your available energy on a massive digestive system grinding through raw food. But if cooking has already done the digestive work for you, if your gut can shrink because the fire is pre-processing your calories, then suddenly the energy budget exists. Suddenly, a bigger brain becomes not just possible, but biologically affordable. Wrangham's hypothesis is that cooking and the human brain evolves together in a feedback loop. More cooking meant more available calories. More calories meant a bigger brain could be sustained. A bigger brain meant better fire management, better food selection, better cooking technique. And around that loop, the species went, incrementally, generation by generation, until what emerged was something genuinely new on this planet. A creature that thought in ways no animal had thought before. Built around a fire it could not live without. Now, here's where we have to be honest about the complications. Because Wrangham's hypothesis is compelling and well supported, but it is not universally accepted. The main problem is the timeline. If cooking caused the anatomical changes we see in Homo erectus 1.8 million years ago, then we need evidence of controlled fire use that far back. And while the Wonderwork cave evidence takes us to 1 million years, solid evidence of habitual, controlled fire use at 1.8 million years is thinner. Some archaeologists argue the anatomical changes preceded reliable fire control by hundreds of thousands of years, which means something else must have started the process. Perhaps just eating more meat, perhaps using stone tools to pound and pre-process raw food, reducing the digestive burden before cooking was even part of the picture. Others point out that the relationship between gut size, brain size, and diet is more complex than the simple trade-off Wrangham describes. The debate is ongoing, the evidence is still accumulating, and the truth probably involves cooking as one powerful factor among several, rather than the single switch that flipped everything. But even Wrangham's critics tend to agree on the fundamental point. Cooking mattered enormously. The argument is about when it started and how much credit it deserves, not whether it changed us. It changed us. That part is not seriously disputed.
There is another dimension to the cooking story that rarely gets the attention it deserves. The social dimension. Because cooking does something that raw eating does not. It requires a fixed location, a fire, a hearth, a place you return to, and a fixed location changes everything about how a group of animals organizes itself. When you have a central fire, where food is prepared and shared, you have the foundation of a home. You have a reason to cooperate. You have a structure around which social bonds can form and deepen. Anthropologists have noted that the hearth may be one of the oldest and most powerful social technologies our species ever developed. Not a tool for war, not a tool for hunting, but a tool for being together. Sitting around a fire, sharing cooked food, talking. In a species that was developing language, this is not a casual observation. This is the architecture of human community. The campfire is where stories got told, where knowledge got passed down, where alliances formed and held. Some researchers have argued that cooking and language co-evolved for exactly this reason. Cooking created the social context in which language became most useful, and language, in turn, allowed cooking knowledge to be shared, refined, and transmitted across generations with a precision that no other animal can manage. You can watch another animal eat. You cannot explain to it why the root tastes better after an hour in the coals rather than 30 minutes. Let's talk about what happens when modern humans try to reverse this. Because the raw food movement of the past few decades has inadvertently run one of the more interesting natural experiments in nutritional science. Thousands of people across Western countries have attempted to subsist entirely on uncooked plant foods, motivated by various combinations of health ideology, environmental concern, and a sincere belief that the cooked food our ancestors developed is somehow less natural than what came before it. The results are instructive. Studies of long-term raw food adherence consistently find several things. First, significant weight loss, usually more than intended, because caloric absorption from raw food is simply lower. Second, in women, rates of amenorrhea, the loss of menstrual function, as high as 30% among those eating fully raw diets, a clear signal that the body is not getting enough energy to maintain reproductive function. Third, despite eating enormous quantities of food by volume, many raw foodists show markers of nutritional stress that resolve quickly when cooked food is reintroduced. The body, it turns out, has been optimized for cooked food for so long that it struggles to run efficiently on anything else. We are not choosing to cook out of cultural habit alone. We are cooking because our digestive systems expect it, because our caloric needs were calculated by evolution around the assumption that fire would do part of the work. The raw food experiment, run at scale across thousands of modern humans with access to the widest possible variety of plant foods, essentially confirms what the fossil record suggests. We crossed a threshold a very long time ago. There is no going back to the raw side and thriving there. We left that version of ourselves behind, somewhere around a campfire, 1.8 million years ago.
and our bodies remember. There is one more thing worth sitting with before we close. Cooking transforms not just our bodies and our social structures, but our relationship with time itself. A raw-eating animal spends most of its waking hours eating. A chimpanzee, our closest living relative, spends somewhere between 4 and 7 hours per day chewing. Not foraging, not traveling, just chewing. Because raw food is dense, fibrous, and difficult to process, and the jaw muscles required to do it are correspondingly enormous. Humans, with our small jaws and our pre-processed cooked food, spend a fraction of that time. And that time had to go somewhere. Some researchers have suggested that the hours freed up by cooking, hours that our primate relatives spend grinding through raw vegetation, are part of what became available for everything else that makes us distinctly human. Tool refinement, social bonding, problem-solving, art. The long, wandering, exploratory thinking that eventually became science and philosophy, and every other extravagance that a species with enough calories and enough time can afford to pursue. You might be, in some measurable sense, able to read these words right now because your ancestors stopped chewing long enough to think.
So here you are, eating something, or about to, and that food, whatever it is, has almost certainly been cooked. You didn't think about it. You didn't question it. You just heated it and ate it the way every human who has ever lived has heated food and eaten it, in every corner of the world, across hundreds of thousands of years, going all the way back to some ancestor crouched over a fire in the African dark, tasting something burnt and deciding without words, without theory, without any framework at all, that this was better, that this was worth repeating, that this was, somehow, the right way to eat. They were more right than they could possibly have known. Because that decision, repeated enough times, passed down and refined and built upon across enough generations, eventually produced a creature with a brain large enough to look back across the entire span of its own evolution and ask how it got here. The answer, improbably, begins with dinner. Let's go back even further, because there's a part of this story that tends to get skipped in the rush toward brain evolution and social bonding. The part about what early humans were actually eating before cooking entered the picture. Because the image many people carry of prehistoric humans is of skilled hunters bringing down large prey, living primarily on meat, and while hunting was certainly part of the picture, the reality of the pre-cooking diet was considerably more complicated and considerably more unpleasant than that image suggests. Our earliest ancestors were almost certainly opportunistic omnivores. They ate whatever they could get, tubers and roots dug from the ground with sticks, wild fruits and berries when available, seeds and nuts when those ran out, the eggs of ground-nesting birds, insects in large quantities, because insects are genuinely one of the most calorie-dense foods available in the natural world, and every primate species that has been studied eats them without hesitation. And yes, meat, when it could be obtained, which early in the evolutionary story meant primarily scavenging rather than hunting, waiting until a larger predator had made a kill, then moving in quickly before competitors arrived, using stone tools to crack open the bones other scavengers couldn't access, and eating the marrow inside. This is not a glamorous diet. It is also, from a caloric standpoint, a brutally inefficient one. The tubers that make up a significant portion of many primate diets are extraordinarily difficult to digest in their raw state. The cellulose walls of plant cells are essentially impenetrable to human digestive enzymes. What little caloric value those raw plants contain is often locked inside structures the gut simply cannot break open effectively. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer populations who still consume significant quantities of wild tubers have found that raw tubers contribute relatively little to their actual caloric intake, despite constituting a large portion of their diet by weight. Cooked tubers, by contrast, become dramatically more bioavailable. The same food, transformed by heat, suddenly releases the calories it was hiding. This matters because it reframes the cooking question entirely. The question isn't just why ancient humans started cooking. The question is why they were able to survive at all on the foods available to them before cooking.
and whether cooking might have been less of a nice discovery and more of a biological necessity that arrived just in time. Some researchers have argued that the shift toward tuber-heavy diets in early Homo, driven partly by climate change that reduced forest cover and increased open grassland environments, created selection pressure for cooking precisely because the diet was shifting toward foods that were calorie-poor when raw. The humans who could extract more nutrition from these staple foods, because they had access to fire and knew how to use it, survived the climate transition better than those who couldn't. Cooking, in this reading, wasn't just a clever trick. It was a survival adaptation that arrived in response to an environmental crisis. The ones who figured it out lived. The ones who didn't. Here's something that tends to surprise people when they first encounter it. The human mouth is deeply weird by primate standards, and most of that weirdness points directly at cooking. Compared to chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, human mouths are remarkably small. Our jaw muscles are dramatically reduced. Our teeth, particularly our molars, are tiny relative to our body size. Our canine teeth, the sharp, tearing teeth that feature so prominently in other primates, are barely there. If you handed our jaws to a zoologist with no other context, they would probably not categorize the owner as an animal that regularly needs to rip apart raw food and grind through tough, fibrous vegetation. They would categorize the owner as an animal that gets its food pre-softened somehow, which is exactly what cooking does. The jaw reduction in particular has left a legacy that most humans deal with daily. Wisdom teeth, the third molars that erupt in late adolescence and almost immediately create problems for a jaw that simply doesn't have room for them. Why do we have wisdom teeth at all if they cause such consistent problems? Because for the vast majority of our evolutionary history, our jaws were larger. Raw diets required more chewing, which stimulated more bone growth in the jaw, which meant more room for more teeth. As our diets shifted toward softer, cooked food, our jaws shrank over evolutionary time. But the genetic instructions for producing a third set of molars stuck around, because evolution is slow and messy and doesn't clean up after itself promptly. The result is a mouth that produces teeth it no longer has space for. Every impacted wisdom tooth is, in some small way, a fossil, a remnant of a jaw that existed before fire changed the menu. Cooking also changed us in ways that are less obvious than jaw size or brain volume, but arguably just as consequential. It changed our gut. The human digestive tract is, by primate standards, remarkably short. Chimpanzees have significantly longer intestines relative to their body size, because processing raw food requires more real estate in the digestive system, more surface area for the slow, difficult work of breaking down cellulose and extracting nutrients from foods that resist digestion. The human gut, shorter and simpler, is optimized for a diet that has already been partially processed before it arrives. It's the difference between a factory that receives raw ore and one that receives material that's already been smelted. The second factory can be smaller, simpler, cheaper to run. And running a shorter gut is considerably less energetically expensive than running a longer one, which circles back to the brain budget argument again. Every calorie not spent maintaining excess digestive infrastructure is a calorie available for the most expensive organ in the human body. The savings compound, the brain grows, the species changes. There is something almost philosophical about where this all leads. We tend to think of cooking as something humans do, a skill, a technology, a cultural practice. But what the evidence increasingly suggests is that cooking is something humans are. It is baked, if you will, into our biology at a level so fundamental that our bodies have reorganized themselves around the assumption that fire will be involved in our meals. We are not a species that invented cooking and then adopted it as a useful habit. We are a species that was shaped by cooking over such an extended period that we have become, in a very real sense, dependent on it. Remove cooking from the human diet entirely, and things go wrong. The body struggles. Reproduction falters. Weight drops below sustainable levels even with abundant food. We are not adapted for the raw world anymore. We crossed out of it too long ago. And there is something genuinely humbling about that realization. The human brain, the thing we are most proud of as a species, the thing that has produced art and science and philosophy and language and every other remarkable achievement of our civilization, may owe its existence to a fire and a piece of meat that fell into it. The greatest cognitive leap in the history of life on this planet might have started with someone tasting something burnt and deciding it was better. The universe is sometimes beautiful in the most absurd ways. So next time you cook something, take a second before you eat it. Not long, just a second. Because you are doing what humans have done longer than agriculture, longer than civilization, longer than any other cultural practice our species can claim. You are using fire to make fire easier to become you. And somewhere in the deep past, that habit changed what you are. It grew your brain. It shrank your jaw. It freed up hours of your day that became thinking and talking, and eventually wondering. The cooking is why you can wonder. The wondering is why you can cook. And somewhere in that loop, the human species was born.